Despite improvements in the Central African Republic, most of the population remains vulnerable to violence, disasters and health emergencies, as according to the United Nations Office for the Co-ordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. The country has faced years of instability, and OCHA reports that in 2025, 38% of the population is so vulnerable that humanitarian aid alone will not be sufficient to ensure their well-being. And to discuss this further, we are joined on the line by Tobias Schult, Deputy Head of the Office for OCHA in the Central African Republic. Tobias, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Africa Update.
Good morning from our end, and happy to speak to you, and thanks for calling us.
Now, Tobias, security and humanitarian conditions have improved in some regions. What is happening in the Central African Republic? Why are things at such a crisis point?
So there's several factors contributing to this, but I think also we need to highlight some good news. So over the weekend, we received some news that one of the armed groups is willing to participate in the peace process, and I think this will further contribute to some of the trends we have been seeing over the last years with a slight improve of the humanitarian situation. But drivers of the crisis, unfortunately, are still the war in Sudan, for example, with an influx of refugees in the northeastern part of the country, very high fuel prices, which then impacts the ability of the normal population to purchase food, access health services, and unfortunately also we face the consequences of climate change, where the water levels are further below, where there's longer trends of the transhumance when the herders are coming down to the more fertile land in the Central African Republic, and this is also contributing to tensions and sometimes then inter-community conflicts in the Central African Republic. These are just some of the factors. And then, of course, while we still have the presence of armed elements in some fighting, this then triggers displacement and then contributes to population movements for which we're aiming to mobilize the resources to respond in a short period of time.
Now, recently the U.S. stopped aid funding, but last week a meeting which included Spain, Belgium, Switzerland and the U.K., as well as the United Arab Emirates, took place. And what came out of that meeting, and how will it benefit the African continent?
So first of all, I think for us it was really a good occasion to share the insights a bit more broadly than what I just said about the humanitarian needs in the country and the most pressing needs around food security, emergency shelter, health, and then of course for the refugee response and some more broader protection needs in the country. So the key message here for us is really we need to work at two different elements at the same time. One, from our side, mobilize the humanitarian resources to respond for those people who are still exposed to shocks, while at the same time also engaging with countries to mobilize not only humanitarian resources, but also engage with the government to strengthen their capacity to deliver social basic services such as access to health, access to school, and all the other elements driving humanitarian needs in the country outside of shocks and epidemics. So really what we would like to see here in the Central African Republic, as we hopefully continue to slowly and progressively phase out, to see humanitarian development actors stepping in and the Central African Republican government to play a much more predominant role in this evolving context.
Now, what role do emerging donors like the UAE play in shaping humanitarian funding trends? Because now they're stepping up to the table where for the longest time the whole world has been reliant on the United States of America.
Thanks. And I think it's a very good question. And I think what we're promoting here in the Central African Republic as elsewhere is really the use of so-called humanitarian pooled funds, or funds where it is not decided yet where the money will go, but where we have the flexibility in the country once the most pressing needs are clear to use these funds. So these are collective funds where several donors can contribute to, and that allows and gives us the flexibility to really help the communities most in distress. So I think, unfortunately, what we have seen over the last years is that needs globally are increasing. So any new donor who's willing to help face the suffering and make a contribution is very welcome. And of course, it's not actually a new player. The Emirates and the UAE have played an important role in other crises. I think what we see is more interest now for them to also play a more active role on the African continent. And as I said earlier, the needs are massive. So like any donor contribution is important for us. And for us, the more we can use unearmarked funding, such as the humanitarian funds or the Global Emergency Response Fund, these are really like pooled funds where different countries contribute and help us and allow us to respond to the most urgent and most pressing needs.
And how are you as OCHA adapting to the reduction of support?
Well, I think we are forced to make some very drastic changes. And I think sometimes it is also an opportunity to make changes in contexts where we have learned to work through existing systems, and it also helps us to adapt and perhaps to be more efficient. One of the things we would like to see here is to be much more decentralized and to be much more close to where the people are, to have a better engagement to what they're actually telling us. I mean, this is something we have been doing over the last years already, but I think for us, what it means is also like looking on the exercises we did already and looking into where we think the most vulnerable people are, and scrutinizing, unfortunately, the work we're already doing, but also doing this in consultations with the people. And the last year we engaged with more than 22,000 households. We heard what their preferences are and trying to really amplify the message of what we're actually hearing from people and what their priorities are. And I think some of the tendencies we have been seeing the last year is already telling in this changing context. Some of the feedback we received is that people want more income generating activities, for example, something we normally as humanitarians don't do. We deliver food assistance, we provide shelter, but what I just said is also a tendency that there's an improvement in the context, that people want to stand on their own feet, want to make decisions for their own lives. So I think this is something we want to continue. And as I said, like we need to make these changes. We need to make these changes very quickly. But the aim always is to find ways to channel the funding to those communities who are most in distress or need it the most urgently. And today, we still need $326 million. We hope we will be able to mobilize this funding to reach 1.8 million people. And if we don't reach these people, the planning we put in place very recently is to say, like, which are the communities and the type of activities where we would like to channel the funding to, if we are not able to meet the mobilization of resources of the $326 million for the Central African Republic.
Well, Tobias, it's been a pleasure chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for today.